Kia ora tawhana, and greetings from New Zealand. Out on the farm this evening. It's quite nice. We just had a rain shower, but the sun's come back out, which is awesome. Means the grass will grow, and yeah, plenty of sheep and so on in the background. I will apologise for any farmyard noises that are going to interrupt the dialogue. But yeah, little something before we start. Last time I managed to fit into this shirt was 1985. You know, one of the few items I took with me when I left the police unit that I was involved with. It's a bit of a testament to the hard work on myself and different projects around here on the farm that I've been, involved with recently. Yeah, I thought I might introduce myself. My close circle of friends call me Mace, and I grew up all over the world. I was born in Cape Town, but grew up partly in Scotland, partly in Rhodesia, mostly in South Africa. All white South African males my age, once we finished school, had 2 years of mandatory military service to complete, which, was something I kind of apprehensively look forward to as a 17-year-old young man. I caught a train, spent 2 nights. That was from Cape Town to Voortrekkerhoogte in Pretoria, and signed up with the Sappers, my allocated unit, ETIR, which is the Engineer Terrain Intelligence Regiment. I completed my basic training. It was 2 years of utter boredom, man. Besides the 3-month, tour of the operational area, which is where I first came across the Koevoet teams. I always promised myself I was going to come back and join the unit. It was a colonel in the police force that actually told me exactly what I had to do to make that happen for myself. I spent many of those evenings going and listening to these 2 guys up in a gun tower in Oshakati. They played a duet on the guitar, and this colonel would often be there. Now, if you took a bottle of Clipdrift brandy with you and some cokes, you could get these guys to play just about anything, But I had some long chats with that colonel. Anyways, what happened towards the end of your 2-year national service stint is all the special force units come around to see if anybody wants to join the permanent force. So, units like the Reckies, the Parabats, and the police came recruiting as well. And that for me was step number 1. So I put my hand up, signed up with the police. And I had to complete a 2nd round of basic training at the police college in Pretoria. At the end of my police training, assignments were being handed out. A lot of guys just wanted to go and, police in their hometown. But I wanted to go back to the border, so I applied to join Koevoet. I was interviewed by someone from the security branch, and I'm sure, look, the good word that colonel offered must have helped get me into the unit, I'll be honest. So after my bush training at Monologue, I ended up in the operational area for a little over 2 years. Once the UN got involved, though, I kind of knew it was time to go back to the States, what we called South Africa back then. When I got back stateside, I went to university, got a teaching qualification, which eventually, stood me in good stead when I brought my family across here to New Zealand. Now, that's a little bit about me, but today I wanted to talk about something, a little bit different than what I have been, or, what I've put up on the channel so far. People always ask about the contact, they want to hear about the tracks, the heat of the pursuit and the adrenaline of the follow-up. But if you really want to understand the Zulu team, man, you look at us while we're out of the bush, you look at us during that week, back at base, and we operated that way. It was a week in, a week out, but that week was glue, it was the transition from being hunters back to being human, and it started the moment those Casspirs kind of rolled across the gates of, or through the gates of Oshakati, caked in that fine kind of Ovamboland dust that, just kind of got into everything, man. Now, Monday morning, it wasn't for sleeping in. You'd wake up, with the sound of the radio, or without the sound of radio communication or the smell of damp bush. But, the habit of the sun kind of stays with you, By 0700, the workshop was humming. First priority was always the vehicles. Those Casspirs took a beating, man. Stuff that would have liquidated any civilian 4x4. We're talking about suspension components, screaming after hitting a pothole, God forbid a landmine, or slamming through mapani thickets, 60 k's an hour. We'd spend hours under those bellies, checking the diffs, tightening bolts that had, vibrated loose and clearing up the debris of the bush. There was a specific smell to a Koevoet workshop, a mix of kind of heavy-duty grease, spent diesel, and that kind of metallic tang that, armor plate has. Now, by Wednesday, the focus shifted to the teeth, you didn't just clean your R5. I mean, that thing lived with you anyway. But for a Zulu team, it was the heavy stuff. We stripped the 0.50 cals, the 50 cals, the twin Brownings, until the workshop floor was a mosaic of steel components. We spent hours, at the Koevoet shooting range, honing skills, testing equipment and weapon setups. There were many custom turrets that were built, and tested for a variety of weapons that, may or may not have been misappropriated from different army depots around Oshakati. It was always somebody knew someone, and for a case of White Horse whiskey, man, anything could happen. I remember my particular Zulu group managed to get hold of a 20mm Hispano cannon from an old de Havilland Empire jet. Not sure what happened to the other 3 because there was normally 4 on board, but we managed to get hold of one of them. Sorting out ordnance was a ritual. You kind of sit there sorting through belts of ammunition, checking for any corrosion or bad links. Every round of 20mm cannon fire had to be perfect. The bush of jam isn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. We talk sure, but there was a focus there. We were kind of resetting the clock, making sure that when we went back out, the equipment was as sharp as the men were. Now you can't work that hard without a release valve, right? And in Oshakati, that valve was the Koevoet Pub at HQ. Wasn't a fancy place. It was a place of shadows, heavy wood, and the kind of atmosphere you only kind of find where men live on the edge, right? We had this particular challenge, though, something of a tradition, right? You'd look up at the top shelves and you'd see this line of bottles that looked like a map of the world, right? There were heavy German schnapps, South African brandies, liqueurs with names you couldn't pronounce. Now, the challenge was pretty simple, but quite lethal in practice, right? The goal was to start at one end of that top shelf and work your way across, right? Shot by shot. I remember nights where, the room would start tilting before you even hit, the quarterway mark, right? We'd be debating the merits of a specific track we'd followed 3 months ago, while trying to stomach a herbal liqueur that tasted like jet fuel. Usually the challenge ended up with somebody, passed out on a chair or, a spirited, if uncoordinated, argument about who had the best driver. But in that room, the rank didn't matter as much as the shed dirt under our fingernails. Then came Sunday, the famous Sunday afternoon braai. This was sacred. A fire would be built high, we'd use leadwood or camel thorn, it gives off that nice, sweet, intense heat. The meat was always plentiful, sizzling on the grid, the smoke drifting across my lieutenant's place, his house, married personnel at that stage got accommodation in the eastern suburbs of Oshakati. This is when kind of the tension finally left your shoulders, right? And, out came the stories, right? But even more important, out came the White Horse, right? There was something about White Horse whiskey and Koevoet that just kind of fit, it wasn't about getting drunk, although obviously that happened. It was about the storytelling, right? We'd sit around the fire, the sun dipping low and turning the sky into that kind of bruised purple haze, and the stories would start, right? Not the war stories you tell people. These were the kind of the internal stories, right? The time the brig sent so-and-so back to the States for shooting that headman's cow, or, the time a certain sergeant tried to outrun a hipper, the time Buckstein rode off his brand new Ford Sierra, when that herd of goats ran in front of the car, him jumping out and finishing off the ones he didn't hit with his R5. All the time the Frick was going down, on a blade on his TT600 down an Oshakati dirt road, and he collected this eagle straight in his chest, right? Took him off his bike. Lucky he didn't actually kill himself. Actually ended up with that bike, brought it back to the States. As the bottle of White Horse made its round, the ghosts of the previous week were kind of laid to rest. We laughed until our ribs ached. We remembered the guys who weren't at the fire with us this time. We looked at each other and realized that, despite the heat, the dust, and the danger, there was nowhere else on earth we'd The coals turned to white ash, and the last of the whiskey disappeared. A quiet would settle over our Zulu team. The gear was packed, Casspirs were fueled and loaded with fresh ammo. The engines were ready. Tomorrow morning, which was Monday, at first light, we'd be heading back out into, through those gates, back into the bush, back into the heat. But for that 1 week that we were in base, we were more than a unit. We were a family. And that Sunday braai, that was the fuel that kind of kept us going until, the next time we smelled the smoke of a home fire. Anyway, wonderful talking to you all. Ka kite anō. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'll see you all next time.